Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist community. A casual conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Margaret Jankowski, founder and director of the Sewing Machine Project, an organization formed in 2005 for the purpose of bringing sewing into people's lives by offering sewing machines, tools, and education. They work with groups committed to using the machines to provide opportunities to create, learn new skills, build self-confidence, and contribute to their own livelihoods and the well-being of their families and communities. The Sewing Machine Project has donated more than 3,200 sewing machines to date around the world and has plans to do much more. Margaret learned to sew as a child, and although she had this tool in her tool belt, she didn't really fall in love with sewing until she worked at a sewing machine dealership as a young mother. She enjoyed working with customers to find the perfect machine and loved the unique nature of each machine. She loved working with women who decided they couldn't sew and helped them fall in love with the art. Margaret, hello, and welcome to So-and-So.
Hi, Meg. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm really happy to meet you.
And you as well. We did a lot of research on the Sewing Machine Project, and I'm excited about sharing the story of this group and your story as well with our listeners. What I really enjoy about your organization is your motto is, "We passionately believe in the possibility a sewing machine embodies." So let's start out with learning more about the Sewing Machine Project. How does it start? Tell us about this.
Well, I'm so excited that you shared that. That's part of our vision statement, that motto that you just shared, and we really do believe that the sewing machine is a tool that can take you so many different places. So the Sewing Machine Project began in the most unexpected of ways. Back in 2005, I was a young mother. I was working part-time at a sewing machine dealership. Um, it was winter time. It was February, and on a Saturday morning, I was sitting and reading. I was scrolling through websites online looking for sewing information, and I came across an article that was written by a BBC reporter, and she was traveling with three women who were returning to their village after the tsunami in Southeast Asia that had happened in December of 2004. So she's walking along with these three women, and she was just kind of interviewing them casually on the road. And she asked them, "What do you hope to find when you return to your village?" And one woman's answer really struck me. She simply said, "My sewing machine." And she went on to describe how she had saved for years to buy this machine, and that it meant the difference for her family. It was how they got by, with her being able to use this machine and do work for other people. And she had so many dreams of teaching her young daughter to sew so that her daughter's life might be a little bit easier than hers had been. And the article just caught me in my tracks. I read it and I read it again, and I thought, my first thought actually was, I don't know what I'd do without my sewing machine. And then I thought, I would survive without my sewing machine. And for this woman, that was a question. And so it was kind of like a door opened when I read that. I began thinking about the women that I worked with at the selling sewing machines, sitting down with somebody and helping them decide which machine to buy, and how many machines were being set aside when the new one came home.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, I bet there are machines that we have around here. And the imbalance really struck me, how this woman had worked so hard to get this one machine, and how here there were more than enough. And I just thought, this doesn't feel fair. And I thought, well, maybe I could collect some sewing machines. And so I did. I went on the local news and I said, I'm going to collect sewing machines. And they poured in. We had more sewing machines than we knew what to do with. And with my volunteers, who were my coworkers basically at the dealership and some friends, we would check over the machines. I, and little by little, we amassed a group of about 75 sewing machines. And I thought, okay, and then the next question was, where exactly am I going to send these? Like,
Yes. What am I going to do now?
now what do I do? And just as these questions would arise, or I'd start to kind of wonder about a question, the answer would be there. So a friend called me and said, hey, I have a friend who works with the American Hindu Association sending relief supplies. Would that be helpful to you? And so it was, and I started working with the local chapter of the American Hindu Association and sent machines to Sri Lanka and to India, to orphanages there that were housing kids that had been orphaned by the storm. And so they were able to use those machines not only to sew clothes for the kids, but also to teach the kids a trade, so that when they did end up going out into the world, they would have a trade, or kind of a tool in their tool belt, basically.
Hmm.
So we sent machines like 5 at a time through the summer of 2005. And so 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. We got up to about 25 machines, and that was towards the end of that summer. And then Hurricane Katrina hit down in New Orleans. And I had been in New Orleans just 2 weeks at a sewing machine conference, 2 weeks before the storm hit. And I thought, we need to shift this. We need to move this. And we did. I went back to the people who had donated money to help get this started, and they said, that's fine. You can shift the plan. And so we started focusing on the Gulf. And in March of 2006, I made my first trip down there, and it just kept growing from there.
Did you ever question whether this would work?
Other people did, but I didn't. I and I didn't. I most of the time I didn't have the answers. I didn't know where I would get the money, or where I would send the machines, or going to New Orleans in a van loaded with sewing machines. I didn't know if there would be anybody down there that wanted them or was ready to have a machine. That was pretty early on. And no, I didn't. There was always just some voice inside me that said, just keep going. It'll work.
Hmm.
And it did.
Can you share any stories about some of the people who have received a sewing machine through your organization?
Oh man, there have been so many. There have been so many stories that have just again opened doors in my head about the need and the ability to fill it. But one of the stories that I love from this actually has to do with 5 machines. I was preparing for one of the trips to New Orleans, and I've made over 20. We had a big long list of people who needed sewing machines. And so each time that I prepared for a trip, I would um, I would go through that list, and I would count the number of machines that I had ready to go. So if I had 50 machines, I would call 50 people on the list and see if they still needed a machine. As time went on, that varied a little bit, but I would find 50 people on my list that still needed a machine, and I'd let them know where I would be and when I'd be there and how they could get a machine. So on one of those days that I was calling people, I called a woman named Anna, and and each time, like as it got further and further along, I'd have to explain, remember I came down and there weren't enough machines, but I put your name on a list and blah, blah, blah. And so I said, so do you still need a sewing machine? And she said, oh, yeah, I sure do. She said, my fiance and I bought this house in a pretty rough part of New Orleans. In fact, it's been vacated. It's a drug house right now, and the neighbors are frightened, and nobody's coming out of their house. And she said, so we're creating a community center there, kind of a safe haven in the midst of this community. And she said, and one of our dreams is to hold classes. And so she said, we'd love to have sewing classes. And then she kind of paused and she said, do you think I could have 3 machines? And I said, sure, we can make that happen. And so we finished our conversation, hung up, and she called me back about 5 minutes later and she said, do you think we could have 5 machines?
Oh boy.
And I said, oh, okay, sure, we can. And at the time, I was keeping the machines in the warehouse in the back of the sewing machine shop where I worked. And so I went back and I kind of stood in the shadows back there and looked at the shelves of machines that I had ready. And I was looking for 5 that could somehow function together in a classroom, that there were enough similarities that it wouldn't be impossible for a teacher to teach on those 5 machines. And that in that particular batch, they just couldn't have been more different. And I was feeling kind of defeated, really. And I thought, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. And I had to leave the store for a few hours. I needed to go. Actually, I needed to step away from the store because I was recording for a show for the first time with Nancy Zeman. She was curious about what we were doing. So I went and did that recording at our public television studio, and I came back about 2.5, 3 hours later, and I came in through the customer entrance of the store. And I walked in, and there, right inside the door, were 5 sewing machines lined up. And I thought, oh, that's weird. People don't leave them there for service, and like nobody leaves sewing machines there. What's the deal with these? And so I asked one of my coworkers, and she said, oh, I'm so sorry you missed this lady. She came in. She's a local sewing teacher, and she just dismantled her classroom. These are classroom grade machines. She's had them all tuned up. They were all exactly the same, and they were all threaded with like nice Gutermann thread, and they were beautiful, and they were for me.
Hmm.
And so I was able to take them down to Anna on that next trip and help her get this sewing classroom set up with these 5 gifted machines. It's just one of those moments where I thought, yep, I'm doing the right thing.
Providence, for sure.
Providence, exactly.
Margaret, you're a sewist yourself. So how did you get started? What type of sewing do you enjoy?
I've known how to sew since I was a little girl. My mom taught me on her featherweight sitting at the dining room table when I was little. But I was never really a big sewer. I didn't sew clothes for my dolls, and I didn't really sew clothes for myself for a long time. But as you mentioned earlier, when I started working at this sewing machine shop, I was teaching sewing classes, and I was working with so many women who had kind of lost that love and feeling for sewing. Like they'd taken a bad home ec class and stuck the machine in the closet years ago,
Sure.
and hadn't pulled it out since. Anyway, it kind of re-energized my ambition to sew, and I fell in love with garment sewing. I fell in love with I mean, through that, I kind of realized, we were using patterns. For instance, we did a white shirt class. Like, let's all make a white shirt that we really love, a white button-up shirt. So we had a white shirt class, and we were using patterns, and I was watching these women struggle with getting the fit right, and I realized that had been part of my problem. I would buy a pattern, and being the impatient person that I am, I would pick out the size I thought was right, and I'd make something, and then it wouldn't fit right. And so I started sewing. I started making patterns. I learned how and started making patterns from garments that I really love, and that made all the difference. So I have my favorite plaid flannel shirt, and I made a pattern from that. So now I can make shirts that fit like that. So that's the kind of sewing I love to do the most, is kind of taking something I love and duplicating it in a fabric I love.
When we talked before, you mentioned that one of the things that you love about sewing is, and you've alluded to this, is figuring out the architecture of what it is that you plan to sew. And you love to imagine the 3D nature of a garment or an accessory and then figure out how to build it. Tell us more about this.
You know, I have realized that when I sew, and especially when I'm trying to figure out how something is created or constructed, it's almost like I enter a room and that piece is hovering there and I can walk around it and I can look at a room in my mind.
Hmm.
And I can and I can walk I can I love the ability to walk around it and look at it and think, okay, so what are the steps to create this? What do I need to do first, second, and third? And I love that process, and it it kind of reflects one of the things I love the most about sewing, which is sitting down and letting my mind roam while my hands are busy with this thing that's so familiar.
Hmm.
So, um, and incidentally, it's one of the things that I hope that we give along with sewing machines. I hope that we give this opportunity for people to free their minds and problem solve and do that kind of work as well as they sew. Um, something that I learned recently that I thought was really interesting. We give a lot of sewing machines to women's shelters, and we gave some machines to a shelter here in Madison. And I was talking with a therapist there, and this is a shelter that helps women who have been kind of pulled out of sex trafficking. And what this therapist explained to me was that often in those situations, people are in such trauma, have experienced such trauma, that they are kind of living in this fight or flight mode.
Hmm.
They are living right here, right now. And they lose the ability to plan forward because that's not part of their wheelhouse in that world. And sewing gives them that opportunity to relearn that, like to plan what you need to do first, second, third to do a sewing project. And she found that using sewing as therapy, people were able to rebuild that ability. And I think that kind of alludes to the architecture of sewing idea. It's like you look at something and you say, okay, well, here's this constructed thing. What do I need to do first to get there? And then what do I need to do beyond that? And I love the idea that sewing helps others regain that ability. I think that's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. And that is something from what you're saying that you can work to teach people to use in not only sewing but other parts of their life.
Exactly.
Margaret, I want to go back to your organization because you have been growing and evolving this for 16 years. Can you give us an idea of the scope of where things are today? And then what are you doing locally, nationally, and internationally?
Well, I, first of all, it kind of sometimes it just blows me away that we're where we are now. When I started collecting sewing machines 16 years ago, I didn't think I was starting an organization. I thought I was just going to collect a few machines and send them to some people. And so it really blows me away to look at the scope of what we're doing. So locally here in Madison, we kind of we have two things going on. We have local classes where we partner with local community centers and they identify the population that really could use these new skills, new sewing skills, whether it's to help their families or to start a little business or something like that. We go in with grant funding. We are able to pay a teacher, and we go in with sewing machines that have been donated to us and set up a classroom. And students take a 6-week course. And in that time, they work on the same machine every week. They learn how to care for that machine, really basic sewing skills, how to thread it, how to clean it. And then they do some simple sewing projects. They also usually do some mending and repurposing. So we kind of teach people, like, if you found this pair of pants at the thrift shop, how do you fix that tear, or how do you hem them up, or whatever you need to do. So we offer that, and then the students pay it forward by doing something that benefits the center where the classes are being held. So if the center serves a large homeless population, they might make fleece hats to keep people warm in a Wisconsin winter, or they might make baby blankets for infants in this that are part of the center. They've made all. I mean, our classes have made all kinds of things, but they're typically to benefit clients of the center. Um, and once they've completed the course and completed the Pay It Forward project, students are gifted the machine on which they learned. So that's one thing that we do here. On another, in another direction, about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, we got thinking about doing a mending program, and we started a simple mending site where people could get things mended for free. We started at a local community center, and we aligned our mending time with their food pantry and their free meal program. So while people were waiting in line for the food pantry or a meal, they could have something mended at our table. Anybody can come; it's all free. And it was so popular that we opened a second site at Madison's downtown library, which has a lot of resources for the homeless population. And so we set up a site there that aligned with times where people could, do job searches and get support that way. So we always align with other programs. And then that was so popular that ended up going from monthly to biweekly to weekly. It was just we had so many clients. And then we opened up a third site at a place called the Beacon here in Madison, which is a day center for people experiencing homelessness. So we aligned it with the lunchtime there. So we have these three mending sites during non-COVID times, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and the mending has been really cool because other groups around the country have heard about it and gotten in touch with us. And we supply the machines and the kind of the template, the best practices that we've learned over these last few years, setting up these sites. And so other groups have started in other parts of the country, other mending sites, which is really cool. So that's kind of our local program. And then nationally, groups apply for machines. We typically work with groups and not individuals. Groups apply for sewing machines, and they kind of send us a proposal that says, this is who we want to teach. This is what we want to teach. This is who's going to teach it. And we need this many machines. And our board looks at all of those and kind of makes sure they align with our mission. And then we send sewing machines to these groups all over the country. So libraries, women's shelters, after school programs, all kinds of stuff. And then internationally, our international work is really limited. Just because we're a small organization and logistics are tricky and expensive. And so we sometimes partner with groups that already have shipping channels in place and have all those logistics covered. For instance, we're currently working with a group that is sending machines to Guatemala to support some rural sewing schools, and they already have a container scheduled out of Los Angeles. So they're making the arrangements to get the machines from Madison to Los Angeles, and then they'll be put on this container and we'll go to Guatemala. So that's the kind of thing that we do. We don't initiate those shipments at this time. It's just kind of, we don't feel like we are in a place to be able to do that very well yet.
Yet that's the operative word. After hearing your story, Margaret, there's a lot of yets, I think, in there.
That is true.
I want to go back to a comment you made earlier. You were talking about one of the primary tenets of the sewing machine project, and that's the idea of paying it forward. And you gave us examples of how people do this out of your classes in Madison, Wisconsin. How does this look nationally? Do you have any other stories of other ways people around the country have paid it forward? Because you do ask them to do this when they get a machine. What are some of the ways people have done this, in addition to the story you told us about Madison?
Well, it's interesting. Whole pay it forward idea came to me because when I started like driving truckloads of sewing machines down to New Orleans, people were so grateful. People would walk into the room and see a machine that was like the one they'd lost, and they were
Mm,
so grateful. And they'd say, "What can I do to repay you?" And I would always think, I feel so fortunate to be able to do the work I do. I don't need you to do anything for me. What I do need you to do is help us create a ripple effect with this. How can we reach more people? And so early on, I would say, tell me how you're going to use this machine to help your community. So some people would teach somebody else to sew, or some people would share their sewing machine with somebody else. Or we had a group of ladies that made little blankets for the NICU unit in the hospital. So we've actually written that into the proposal form that we send to groups that are applying for machines. We say, how are you going to use these machines to help your community? We ask people to do it in a sewing related way
hmm
and something that makes sense, that's really helpful. So groups have done all kinds of stuff. During COVID, people were making masks for others in their community. But prior to that, we hear a lot of people that say, there are some little kids on my block. I'm going to teach them how to sew. Or, um, I've noticed, like I mentioned, the hats, the fleece hats. We have people saying, I'm going to make a batch of fleece hats and take them down to our local community center and just put them there for people that need them.
hmm
So people use that machine to help others, and that's the key. So we can say we've actually physically handed out over 3,200 machines, but I know that we have touched many more lives than that because we let these little ripples go out from each machine that we give.
Sure. I want to go back to the yets that we were talking about, because you've done so much in a short amount of time, touched so many lives. What's next for you, Margaret? And what's next for the Sewing Machine Project?
Oh my, oh goodness. The sewing machine project has kind of informed my life, which is just an interesting thing. It almost feels like its own entity, like I'm being asked to guide it more than form it.
hmm
I just feel like it's such a gift to be able to do this. I personally have been working on a book about the sewing machine project. So I'm I've got a draft done, and so what I hope is next is finding somebody that's willing to publish it. That's a big ask. That's a lot for something that's a true to life story.
Perhaps this podcast can be an accelerant for you for that. Somebody can hear that and say, "I want that book."
I hope so. I hope so. For the sewing machine project, I feel like whenever we've had a choice of whether to go broader or deeper, we've always chosen deeper.
hmm
Um, it's not my intent to have world domination here. um, However, as I mentioned, our international work is pretty limited. And so, what I hope to do in the next few years is establish some deeper connections with um, corporations, sewing machine manufacturers, as well as other groups that are working in different areas of the world so that we can figure out better ways to offer sewing machines to other groups. I feel like I can identify where we hit problems, and I think there are solutions to those problems, and I'm kind of just waiting to figure out what they are. But I would say that's kind of my focus right now, is figuring out how we can do that. Not on some gigantic scale, but how can we do that a little bit better?
Sure.
I think of how here in the United States we are working through immigration issues. And I think, okay, how can we make lives better in Central America for people? How can we help them establish what they're doing there so they don't feel a need? They're not pushed to run to the border.
Mm-hmm.
How can we help people make their lives better where they are so they're in their community where they have people they love? So that's kind of where my focus is right now.
Lots of opportunity. Margaret, we talked about a lot of things. I asked you a lot of questions. Is there a question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
Oh man. You've asked me some really good questions. I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot of the scope. Um, there are many. Anticipating this podcast, I was thinking through so many of the stories and so many of the things that we've done over the years, and the ways that we've tried something and it hasn't quite worked, and we've learned from it and we've gone in another direction. There have been so many lessons. I don't have a specific question that I wish you'd asked, but I did have a story that I think sewers would appreciate. In 2009, I went with a kind of a relief team over to Kosovo, and they had sent a container before our visit, and we had sent 25 machines, actually from Bernina, as a matter of fact, on that container. And then we went over to visit, and so I hand carried a kind of a fancier baby lock embroidery machine, and a overlock machine. And so I hand carried those on the plane, and I was so excited to show the sewers. We were basically working with a little NGO. So these were accomplished sewers in kind of a war torn region of Kosovo, an area where there were so many war widows and people were looking for work. So this sewing room was trying to figure out a way to teach more people to sew and get more people engaged.
Hmm.
But anyway, I had this fancy, fancy, fancy sewing machine, and I took it with me, and I was so excited to sit down with these ladies and say, "Look at this! It makes an alphabet and it makes pictures, and like it does all this super cool stuff." And one of the features of the machine, which is a feature on on any fancy machine these days, is it had an automatic buttonhole, and which seemed like minor to me because it made an alphabet and cool pictures, like it was so cool. And so we got there, and I'm like, "Hey, look at the alphabet." And they're like, "No, let's see that buttonhole again." And I'm like, "Hey, look, it makes a picture." "No, let's see that buttonhole again." We made just tons of buttonholes that day. It was pretty incredible.
Just what you thought was going to get their attention wasn't. It just
Exactly.
and the things you've made this point, and this is good, that the things that we may take for granted, other people find amazing throughout the work that you do.
Exactly. And I mean, that's one of the biggest gifts, is just, it's like you get your eyes opened again and again and again. Not only to these little details like a buttonhole, but I mean, daily I'm reminded of how much need there is in
Hmm.
the whole world and in my own backyard. And at the same time, I'm reminded about how many people there are out there who are trying to figure out ways of addressing need in a creative way. So it's totally a gift.
One of the things that I know is important to you is, as people are thinking about donating machines or wanting to get a hold of you, you have a request about the actual machine that they donate to you being in good working order. And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
You bet. If you visit our website, you'll see kind of a set of guidelines about machines, and people do contact me sometimes and say, "Oh, well, can we bend the rules?" So basically, we ask that machines are in excellent working order, which means that everything that machine was designed to do works. So if it has 30 stitches, those 30 stitches work. And and the button, the bobbin winder works and everything like that. So, kind of our tagline, we have a group of women volunteers that we call our machinist union, and they check over every machine that we get and to make sure that everything does work. But our tagline is, we're passionate, but we're not technicians. So we do ask that sometimes people will contact me and say, hey, I've got a machine and there's just this little problem with it, but otherwise it works great. And I will write back and say, thank you so much. Please have that repaired before you donate it. So that's our deal there.
That makes sense. Margaret, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. If any of our listeners would like to reach out to you or get involved with the Sewing Machine Project, what's the best way for them to do so?
So you can learn more about the Sewing Machine Project by visiting our website, and that's thesewingmachineproject.org. And on our website, you can also find out how to donate a machine. You can read those guidelines. You can find out how to donate money, because we're all funded by by donations from sewers all over the country. And there's also a way to make contact through that website. It'll say contact us. And if you click on that and send an email, that comes directly to me. So if somebody has, listened to something and didn't quite need some clarification or has a question, you can just do that and I'll get an email and I'll write right back to you. So that works. And I should mention as well that when we are, it kind of goes without saying, but we are a nonprofit. We're a 501c3. So any donations of machines or money are tax deductible, which is always helpful.
thesewingmachineproject.org. Terrific. Margaret, thank you again so very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Well, there you have it. Another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing or quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life, a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to megoodman@theflintrock.com and put "You should hear their story" in the subject line. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.